Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you today. We've got the pleasure of having an extra session today in our environmental education series to cover a couple of really interesting topics. One is advanced nuclear reactors, and the other is the power grids in the U.S. and in Texas, and implications on renewables and everything like that. So. Yeah, we look forward to a fun session, interactive. Again, welcome to this ninth of the series that we've had now that's covered everything from a whole perspective on our planet, from the history in the beginning till today. We've covered, what forms weather, how that changes things. We've covered the issue of climate change, obviously one of the most important issues in our day and where that's going. We talked about energy and energy futures. We talked about nuclear and nuclear waste on the beach. We talked about the impact that some of the main religions in our world have had and are having in the area of climate. And then we've talked about the COVID crisis and how that has intersected with climate. And so it's been a terrific series that we've had here, and I know we're all very appreciative of the work that Dr. Tom English has done in presenting this series for us. For those of you that are new to this series, my name is Dave Rice, and I'll be your host for the event. I think most of you that have been involved in this series now have come to appreciate, all the richness that Dr. English brings to the topic of the environment. He certainly has. For those of you that are new, just a couple of notes on him. He's a scientist that has accomplished so many things in his life. He's had such an interesting and diverse career. A lot of it has really, though, been in the area of activism around environmental science. And so in that regard, he was the author of California's Clean Air Act back in the late 80s. Which is largely responsible for getting rid of the smog that we had here that used to really plague the state of California, especially Southern Cal. He's collaborated with a number of dignitaries around the world. One of the things that he cherishes the most is receiving on behalf of the Patriarch Bartholomew, a Congressional Medal of Honor for their work on climate. And as I've mentioned in the past, one of the things that I appreciate the most about Dr. English is his unusual ability to communicate difficult concepts in very easy to understand ways. He's got a huge passion for educating others on our climate crisis and the threats that it's bringing to all of us. And that's really the purpose of this series, is to try to educate us so we can all be more aware and have better discussions with our family and friends about the various topics, and to become engaged and become active where it makes sense and where we can be. I hope you really enjoy this presentation today, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tom English. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks very much, Dave. It's always a nice introduction. I really appreciate it. Today we've got a kind of a full agenda. We're going to be talking about advanced reactors. These are reactors that do everything that that the current generation doesn't do so well with. And we'll see whether or not they're absolutely essential to solving the climate crisis, or maybe we don't even need them. So we'll take a look and you can make up your own mind on that. Then we're going to talk about sort of a more subtle topic, a topic involving the grid. When you put stuff on the grid companies are used to having a bunch of backup power called standby power, mostly natural gas, where the generators just sit there and don't do anything until you tell them to turn on whenever you need some more power. So if we're trying to eliminate fossil fuels, we need to basically do something different for standby power. The renewables offer a problem for that because they tend to be intermittent. The sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So what we're going to have to do is to figure out how to essentially make those things harmonious with the grid. And we'll give you some examples of how to do that. So the first slide here basically shows us what we're going to be doing today. On the right is the scale model of the TerraPower sodium-cooled nuclear reactor. This is the one that Bill Gates has been working on since about 2007. He founded a company called TerraPower then, and this is his answer to what advanced reactors are like. And it is a nice picture down there of basically some transmission lines.
Yeah, Tom, you might just want to go to the full screen.
That'd be better.
Yeah.
There we go.
Presentation mode.
Here's some comments by Bill Gates on a CNBC Squawk Box show about 2 weeks ago. Bill Gates says that nuclear power will absolutely be politically acceptable again. It's safer than oil, coal, natural gas, and et cetera. And then he goes on to say below that nuclear power has a problem to overcome, a baneful reputation garnered by association with the atom bomb. It's the same sort of mechanism that makes an atom bomb work, only it's more controlled. And radioactive disasters such as Fukushima and 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. But it's a necessary, worthy, and surmountable challenge to correct the naysayers. So we'll take a look at that and just see whether all that is merited. There's a different view from a group called the Union of Concerned Scientists. And they basically say if nuclear power is to play an expanded role in helping with climate change, newly built reactors must have certain characteristics. They must be safer, they must be more secure and more economical than the current generation reactors. So what they've done is they've looked at this and they say one approach to improving nuclear power has been to pursue the development of a different kind of nuclear reactor. These are called non-light water reactors. The ones we have currently are what are called light water reactors. So this is something different, fundamentally different from today's light water reactor. But is different actually better? So that's the question for the first half of our discussion today. Is different actually better? To get some idea of that, let's take a look at just how a current light water reactor would work. This is the kind that was built by Westinghouse. It's a pressurized light water reactor. What you see on the far left is basically the heart of the reactor. We have a vessel in which the fuel is contained, and then we have these control rods that basically move up and down, and they essentially limit the number of neutrons that are being produced in the vessel. If you get too many neutrons, you could have an explosion. So what you do is these control rods basically get the thing to the right temperature and not above that. So this is our source of power for nuclear energy. We then take that power and make some hot water with it. The hot water goes into a vessel nearby called a steam generator. And that steam generator basically generates steam. The water that comes into the steam generator gets cooled by this process, and the colder water comes back out and gets pumped back into the nuclear reactor again. So we have a closed loop of water there. Now the steam that comes out of the reactor goes up and goes into a turbine. The turbine is the thing that spins around, so like a fan. And so this steam turbine here spins around and is hooked to an electrical generator, which produces the power of a nuclear power plant. So the steam turbine has this steam going through it, and it goes right through it, losing some of its energy, and it goes into a thing called a condenser, which takes the steam, cools it down with this cooling coil here, and converts it back into water. So the water from from this unit from this condenser goes down through a pump and back into the steam generator. So we have another closed cycle for water. So water does all the work, essentially. It takes the energy from the nuclear fuel, makes it into steam, blows this turbine around, and makes electricity. So that's the basic idea of all light water reactors. Now, the non-light water reactor, the NLWR, is different. It's different in many respects, but one of the main differences is in the area where you have the nuclear part, the nuclear reactor part, the so-called core, what you find there is that you don't have any water around it. You basically have a metal called sodium, and the sodium is so hot that it's liquefied. So you have liquid sodium coming through the reactor. This pump pumps it. Oh, by the way, this little guy on the side here gives you an idea of the size of things. These are, even though they call these fairly small units, these are big. So the sodium basically comes in there. The cold sodium in the bottom comes into the reactor, gets warmed up. The control rods are doing the same process they did in the light water reactor. They namely keep the core from getting too hot. So what happens is that sodium then comes out through a hole in the containment in the vessel here, and there is an exchange loop for heat to come out of this. So what they do in this exchange loop is they have sodium coming through these pipes. So the sodium comes out of there hot, it'll go over, then it comes back in cold. So we don't lose the sodium. So we have sodium near the core and sodium in this heat exchanger. This is a drawing of the system there. It's much classier than the one that I just showed you. This is the reactor part down here. So this long stretch of things here are the fuel rods here. That gives you some idea. Now, what we'll do is we'll complete the diagram. The part we talked about so far is this section on the left. So here we have the sodium coming out of the reactor hot, going into a so-called steam generator. This time it goes into the steam generator. It cools down just like before. Only what it does is then it comes back as cold sodium and gets pumped back into the reactor to get heated up again for a complete loop. So that's the basic sodium loop. So we have no water in this part of the sodium loop, and in the steam generator it's half sodium, half water. Now we have water circulating through here. The water gets hot, converts into steam, goes to the steam turbine, and then goes through the turbine and makes it rotate. And the generator's hooked to that, so it rotates also. And then we get electrical power out. So the steam comes out of the steam turbine, goes into a condenser to basically condense the water back to a liquid form. A pump puts it in there, and the loop is complete. So that's the basic design of these so-called advanced, many of the advanced non-liquid water reactors. So what we see here is what the whole thing looks like. So you have to decide whether or not this makes any great sense compared to what we currently have. You have a water loop and a sodium loop, and you want to keep those things separate because the steam or sodium and water don't react well. We might have some comments on that later. In the last week in March, a group called the Union of Concerned Scientists put out a publication where they took a look at all these advanced nuclear reactors, and they came up with a title of their publication called "Advanced Isn't Always Better." It's different, but it's not better. So we'll go through some of their thoughts and conclusions and share those with you. The claimed advantages of an advanced nuclear reactor is that designs lower costs. Good idea. They can be built quickly, contrary to the ones we have now, which take a long time to build. We can reduce the accumulation of nuclear waste. And on the nuclear waste on the beach talk, we talked about how nuclear waste is stranded at all the nuclear reactors in the country. And you can make safety better. You can reduce the risk of nuclear proliferation. You can have a passive shutdown and cooling. In other words, you don't require any kind of extra equipment. If something goes wrong, it just automatically shuts down and automatically cools. And it also has the ability, which is kind of an interesting and novel concept here, to take the nuclear waste that we have and use it as a fuel. So we'll talk about all of these things. And some non-liquid water reactor vendors claim they can demonstrate, build something and show you how it works. They can get a license for it and deploy their design within a decade or two. This certainly doesn't follow the track record that the nuclear industry has had for the last 40 or so years, but we'll basically take a look at that too. So they're basically saying maybe in somewhere between 10 and 15, 10 and 20 years, say 15 years, they can actually get something going. This is what the summary of the conclusions that the Union of Concerned Scientists came up with looks like. These conclusions are really hard to read here. So what I'm going to do is to show you some small parts of them, one part at a time. They look at things like safety. How safe is this advanced reactor compared with the normal light water reactors? How do they do with the nuclear waste? How does that work out? How about resource efficiency? Are they efficiently using the uranium and other resources? And what about things like proliferation and terrorism? Can people use this stuff to blow up a city? So basically, those are the categories. And the idea is you would hope that the new advanced reactors would do better in each of these categories, so that if we did replace the current nuclear reactors, we would replace them with something better. You sure don't want to replace them with something worse. So those are the basic characteristics they'll look at. And the first thing we'll examine those characteristics. We'll look at the nuclear reactor that Bill Gates's organization is trying to produce. It's called a natrium nuclear reactor. Natrium is the Latin word for sodium. So it's based on sodium, and it's very similar to the diagram that I showed you earlier. Basically, here is a color code here. If we get a bright red, it's moderately worse than the current reactors. A bright green is moderately better. Orange is slightly worse, etc. And if we get gray, we have not enough information. So let's look at Gates's reactor. In terms of safety, they say it's moderately worse, even though the organization Terraformer claims it's going to be better. In terms of waste, it's slightly worse, even though the organization claims that it's significantly better. In terms of resource efficiency, the use of uranium resources, it's slightly worse. And in terms of terrorism proliferation, it's again slightly worse. So it's got 1 moderately worse and 3 slightly worse. I would say that's not a stellar report card. Now, if we look at the best one of the list, they had a list of about 10 or so different advanced reactors. This is called the molten salt fast reactor. It has the same moderately worse score for safety, so it doesn't improve safety. It says it is significantly better in terms of the waste, and we'll talk about that in a second. So they say, okay, we may have our problems, but we know how to solve the waste problem. In terms of resource efficiency, is moderately better. So it gets good scores on both nuclear waste and efficiency. And it gets a bad score in terrorism. So what they do is they basically use a material, thorium, which basically requires, in the way they use it, requires some reprocessing of the material. So what you do is you basically get some gains in the area of taking out some of the radioactive nuclides in the waste, and you basically fix those up so that you can use those radionuclides for nuclear fuel, but in the process you're using things like plutonium in the waste cycle as an item of commerce. And so that makes the unit worse for things like terrorism and so forth. So that's the best scorecard that we have there. So basically, there's none of them that really look all that great. Now, we talked about Jim Hansen before. He's one of my idols in terms of climate change. He's one of the best there is, but he basically believes this stuff is, these advanced reactors are absolutely viable, absolutely needed. Now, so if we were to go for this process of we're going to really go and build 1,000 or so of these advanced reactors, our first one would be built in about 15 years, given the normal delays that we would expect here. And that's a long time to wait for us, because that'll put us behind the horse in terms of the Paris agreements. So basically, we're going to be about 15 years lagging in our agreements if we don't proceed with our activities with renewables. There is a concept that is getting a lot of press since right around the year 2000. It's called the nuclear renaissance. And the basic idea of the nuclear renaissance is these things are really great and we're going to build a lot more of them. And so what happened is the politics of nuclear became popular around the year 2000. And the NRC received applications to build more than 24 new reactors. These were all of the light water reactor category. The idea was they could build these more quickly and cheaply with advanced safety, because we've learned how to do it. So what happened is the prospective past purchasers canceled nearly all of these before ground was broken. They just didn't seem to be good enough. And two places went forth. A place called the Summer Plant in South Carolina, and another place in Georgia. The Summer Plant is shown below here. What you see here are these are the basis, beginnings of some cooling towers for the nuclear reactors. The project was abandoned, so they never got to look like a real cooling tower. These are the nuclear reactors over here. Just some of the shell material here, the containment material. So basically, they decided it just cost too much, and the costs were too much, and it's going to take too long. So they gave up on that one. So that was one of the two areas that we're going to do it. And then they tried in the second area. This is in Georgia. It's called the Vogel plant. And basically, they went a little bit further there. They got the cooling towers up. The parts of the buildings are up for the reactor. And they're still trying to do that. The problem is that it's the same problem as the other place. It's way over cost and way under schedule. So they're trying to hoping that the government's going to bail them out. So since these light water reactors are proven to be susceptible to severe accidents, we know Fukushima and we know Chernobyl, et cetera. And they also have these nuclear wastes that are long-lived. Basically, the nuclear establishment is pursuing this new idea of non-light water reactors. They call them advanced reactors. Now, most of these designs really come from sort of old-fashioned designs that have been around for 30, 40 years. In case of the so-called, in the case of the so-called liquid metal cooled fast reactor, that was on the books even before the light water reactor was on the books. So that's more like 60 years. So these aren't exactly new ideas, but they're the latest and greatest. So we're now promised, since the nuclear renaissance of the year 2000 failed, we're now promised another nuclear renaissance, but they say it's going to be better this time. So the Union of Concerned Scientists analyzed it, and they say that this new crop of advanced reactors is not better in terms of safety, security, sustainability, nuclear proliferation, and nuclear terrorism. So we don't really need to worry about waiting 15 years for these deficient possibilities to become some sort of reality. We can move ahead with what we have now. So we'll have to learn to deal with the drawbacks of renewables. I mean, the sun doesn't shine all the time, so solar plants don't work all the time. And same with wind plants. The wind doesn't blow all the time. So let's do some examination of how this problem of putting renewables on the grid is and how it makes the utilities sort of change their vision of how a grid should be operated. We'll look at the Texas grid because of it's big and it's unusual. Also because they recently had a big problem, and we'll talk about the problem. And we'll also look at the California grid, since it's a more what do you call robust grid, meaning it has a lot more renewables on it. And we'll use these as examples of how to do it. So we'll stop though, first of all, for some questions.
Okay. We've got a few questions, and we've also got a comment that Rody echoed basically what you just said. He said there have been sodium-cooled reactors for at least 60 years. Rickover, I believe that's Admiral Rickover, had GE build one for a nuclear submarine. They decided it was a bad idea.
Yeah, well, Rody's my old boss, so he's basically right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rickover was a genius kind of guy and had some really interesting idea. But yeah, the sodium reactor is not a brilliant idea. Whenever I was a young engineer, my first job, I was working for Pittsburgh Plate Glass, and I was trying to make a glass semiconductor. So that was kind of an interesting, novel idea. So in doing that, I was using a lot of pure sodium. So what we would do is get, during lunch, just for entertainment, we would get a real small slug, maybe an eighth of an inch in diameter of the sodium, and then drop it into one of the sinks in the laboratory and watch it putt around like a little boat in the water. So that was sort of fun to do. And we must have done that a couple dozen times. And then one time we did it, and all of a sudden, instead of it putting, the thing just blew up, a big yellow flame. So I got the idea that sodium and water don't necessarily react in a very friendly manner. So that's one of the things you have to make sure of. Any of these reactors that had sodium and water, that if you ever had a leak, God bless you, that leak didn't allow the sodium and the water to get together, because if that happened, you would have a lot of hydrogen gas to deal with.
Okay, and then Randall, this was early on, I think before you sort of got to the thorium reactor issue, but he says thorium reactors, all the buzz a few years ago, pipe dream or viable future alternative?
Well, it gets a lot of press. The basic idea of a thorium reactor is that you take some of the stuff that we currently consider nuclear waste, high-level nuclear waste, and you essentially reprocess it. That means you go through some chemical separation, so you can take out the plutonium and the americium and a few of the other useful kind of radionuclides and do something with them. So what happens is, since you take that out of the waste becomes different. You get some new waste generated. If you go through the so-called Oregon Code, which is the code they use, named after some theologian in the 3rd century, if you take a look at the output of the Oregon Code, what happens is the stuff that's produced is quantitatively different. I mean, different amounts of plutonium, different amounts of americium, and so forth. But what happens in terms of the toxicity, it doesn't change the toxicity much at all. So there's no real advantage. But you do have the disadvantage that once you go with the thorium cycle, you're now committed to using plutonium in a part of your commercial fuel cycle. So you're using things you can make bombs out of as a part of your normal cycle of business. And that's a very dangerous thing. It's what we have now is a dangerous enough system. where they keep track of the best they can with the plutonium and the enriched uranium. But let's not make it any worse. So I would say that in terms of any social agreement for thorium, I would think the likelihood, even if the thing was better from everything else, I would think the likelihood it would be poor, especially since we have other alternatives that are cheaper and much safer.
Okay, and then here's another question. What happens if there is a leak in the sodium water steam generator?
Well, the sodium mixes with the water, and you get sodium hydride, and you get hydrogen gas. So the hydrogen gas is the thing that blew up Fukushima, Chernobyl. It didn't blow it up. It didn't blow the thing out of the reactor in 3 Mile Island. But basically, this is the stuff that essentially blows up. So, you know, God, you're making the same mistake again. You're getting some sort of thing that's going to generate hydrogen gas because you can never count on no leaks. We always seem to have things occur that we don't expect. Like they never expected any kind of accident at all at Fukushima. And certainly everyone knew it was impossible to have more than one nuclear reactor go bad at once. And they basically had 3 meltdowns there simultaneously. So yeah, it's don't invite disasters, avoid them.
And then I guess last question, you know, the advanced reactor folks make a big deal about being more efficient on using current spent nuclear fuel, nuclear waste. And it sounds like what you're saying and the Union Concerned Scientists are saying is that's not really necessarily the case. And that's true in all cases except that one that you had put up there. The metal.
In several of the designs, they do have less long-lived radionuclides than the light water reactors. So those are pluses. But the ones that do that all have the same common problem of requiring some sort of thing that could be used for nuclear weapons becoming an item of ordinary commerce. So it's just too big of a social risk, and the benefits are too small. They do claim, though, an interesting thing that I think is fascinating, that they say you could run one of these reactors for 100 years on the spent nuclear fuel in Paducah, Kentucky. So they're looking at spent fuel as being a real asset instead of a liability. I think we should basically sell them the fuel at a good price that we have around San Onofre so they can have more of it. So let's look at the problems of making a grid effective with these intermittent renewables. Is it possible to do? Is it real costly? Let's just take a look. This gives you some idea of the grids for the nation right now. We have basically a green grid that is the Western grid. We have a blue grid that's called the Eastern grid, although we have most of the Midwest is in there. And then we have a yellow grid, that's a Texas grid. And the blue grid is connected to the green grid, so there can be some power sharing from the green section to the blue section and vice versa. If the economies make it so. The speed of electrical propagation through these transmission lines is quite fast, so that you don't have to worry about big delays here. Whereas the Texas grid is completely isolated. They didn't want to have any part to do with all the rules and regulations that the green grid and the blue grid have. So they're going to do their own thing. So there were some problems with that we'll talk a little bit later about during this very cold spell that led to the blackouts in Texas. Let's get some idea of where things are in Texas. This is Texas. And the blue shows where large wind installations are. And the gold shows some installations that are solar. They tend to have a fairly significant amount of wind power in Texas, the order of 20% or so, but the solar power is only about 1%. So they love wind, they don't seem to like solar. It's interesting to know the reasons why. The wind resources are in two categories mainly. There's the West Texas wind, which is to the west side of Texas here. And there is the South Texas wind, which is near the south and also the Gulf. So those are the two sources that we'll talk about. So this is what happens with solar. There's a big solar array. Here's the sun. Now, as the sun shines during the day, when the sun first gets up, the power is low. And as it gets closer to noon and so, the power gets higher and higher. And then it starts to get lower and lower until the evening. So what we find out is that nothing surprising here is that the solar power unit doesn't do too well when the sun is not in the sky. So it's a designed intermittent power source. So you have to recognize that in applying it to the grid, because you have to get some sort of power during the evening, because you aren't going to get it from solar unless you use some storage. We'll talk about storage in a few minutes. So first of all, we'll get some wind to add to the system. This will be wind from the west. So this is the west wind coming in here, and that's shown in this yellow here. So what we see here is the west wind does blow at night. It didn't blow as well during the day, and it picks up in the night again. So this gives us a power during the day and night. And if we add the wind from the south, what you do is you get this new section, the green section here. And again, so now you have three different sources of power, and the total power that you have available to you looks something like this. So we no longer have a problem with day and night. We now have a problem with this weird curve here. So we don't have, we have to then somehow figure out how to match this power on this curve with the need for electricity, or else we'll be wasting resources or not satisfying the need. So that's the basic game we have when we're designing a grid. Now, in terms of the blackout in Texas, that was a real surprise to lots of people. The same kind of thing occurred back in 2011, only it wasn't as severe. Let's look at some of the data. This is the energy being produced by from natural gas in Texas, and we'll just look at 2 periods of time. This is a period. This is pretty much an average production of energy before the crisis, and after the crisis, it looks more like this. So we see a significant drop in the natural gas availability. What happened is some of the natural gas is still in the wells, of course, and some of those wells have the gas mixed with water and some other materials. And whenever it got real cold, the water froze and the gas couldn't come out. So that caused a significant drop in the availability of gas. Let's look at some of the other fuels. Texas has a pretty hearty supply of energy from coal. It gets about 20% of its electricity from coal. It used to get about 40%, so it's dropping it as quickly as it can. But what we see here is at the same time, whenever the cold snap came in, the coal went down some and stayed down during the entire snap. So it's not as big a drop as the natural gas drop, but it's a significant drop. And we'll see a clutter of other things down below here. Basically, this is nuclear, the green. Basically, you see it's flat, nice baseline characteristic. It drops during the snap here. Again, water availability, but not much. So basically, you can't blame nuclear. Looks like the biggest blame is so far on natural gas. This is basically solar peaking during the day. Not much change there. This is wind. Wind did go down somewhat. So basically, if you take a look at the data, what you find out in terms of the gigawatts lost, nuclear, not much. Coal, about 5 on this scale. Wind, more like about, say about 8, and gas about 20. So the real culprit here is the natural gas, contrary to what the governor stated. We might talk about that a little bit later. So now we have a situation where we have 24 hours of renewable power available day and night. Let's see what we can do to match this power to the electrical demand without wasting energy or using excessive fossil fuel backup generators, these ones that just are idle until you need them. We'll use California for this example. And we'll use a talk that was put together back in 2014, so it's pretty old now. So some of the options here won't be the best for today. And for example, we won't have any serious examination of storage, whereas today we would. So this is called teaching the duck to fly, and I'll explain the meaning of that. It's produced by a guy by the name of Jim Lazar, who is works with a group called the Regulatory Assistance Project. My son-in-law is Carl Linville, is a principal of this organization. They go around talking to regulators and PUC commissioners and plant operators to try to basically convince them that the renewables are a useful thing for them to use. So we're seeing some problems to the grid. Variable loads, caused by windmills, solar systems, and so forth. The attitude of many of the engineers who work for the utilities is, we've had variable loads forever. This is not new. So we know how to handle variable loads. It's just a question of how do we do it? So the wind is certainly variable. The solar is predictable, but not available in the late evening peak demand. So we have to account for that in our management. By the way, this is what's been going on in batteries. I mentioned batteries before. The price of batteries, this says, has gone down by 70% between 2015 and 2018. So you can see the price is dropping like a rock. It was to $625 per kilowatt hour here. And I put this green portion here in from Bloomberg. He has an article and basically came out for the 2020 data and saying it's dropped down to $137 per kilowatt hour. So that's a significant drop. That's more like 90% drop. So all indications are that the price of batteries will continue dropping and dropping. So battery storage is something we should certainly consider in any future analysis. This is an examination of a particular utilities situation. Back in 2012, their needs during the day looked like this. They would go down to about 19,000 megawatts, and they would go up to maybe 23,000 megawatts. That changed the next year. It got a little bit lower during the day because some solar power was added, and basically their nighttime load shifted. So they had to have more during the evening. So let's look further and see what's going on here. So we have basically an area of yellow and red. The red area basically shows you that during the evening, more energy is needed from fossil fuels than was needed the year before. Whereas in the yellow area, we have a lot of daytime solar energy, so it reduces the need for fossil fuels. So the shape of the curve looks for two things: the total amount needed and the amount needed from fossil fuels, and the amount needed for renewables. So let's look into the future and see what happens. Well, we have a crystal ball here that shows you from 2012 what the load looked like, 2013, 14, down to 2020. What we see here is that we're getting a real drop in the need for fossil fuels during the day. But then what happens is we need to ramp up in a pretty steep neck of this curve here to have a lot of fossil fuels putting online. So we have to have a lot of standby fossil fuels. So this curve here looks something like a duck. So what they do is they call this the duck curve. So more solar decreases daytime fossil fuel need, but increases the ramp fossil fuel needs as we're bringing up this ramp here. So what we have to do is teach this duck how to fly. We have to flatten this thing out so that we can satisfy all the needs of our customers, but also do it with the most profitable use of the equipment. So the thought goes on to say, guess what? Ducks can fly. So there's a duck, and that's the shape that it has in the water, a big belly sticking down there, neck sticking up pretty steep here, tall neck. So, but this is when a duck flies. Okay, notice the neck is out straight and the belly is in flat, so it's much more efficient. So we're teaching the duck how to change from this shape to this shape here while it's flying. So this is a utilities analysis. This is the total analysis that this utility says it has for electrical needs, power in megawatts in this scale, time of day here, midnight, noon, midnight. So what their total need is pretty flat during the day, goes up at night to around 4,000 megawatts. And down here, it goes to about 2,000 megawatts. So it's a span of needs of about 2,000 megawatts. That's a big span. Now, if we basically look at the need that it has, we take out the solar and the wind, the non-solar and non-wind load. This is just the fossil fuel load. What we find out is it looks like this. So there's our duck curve. Okay? The total load and the non-solar, non-wind load. There are some ways to flatten it out here. There are 10 of them here. I won't go through all those because it would take forever, but we're going to pick out a few of them and examine those. So we'll look at what we can do by changing the orientation of our solar panels that are, say, on roofs. For example, aiming them more to the west, because that should cause them to be pick up more sunlight as the sun is setting. We'll talk about using solar thermal with storage. Take some of that energy that's stored during the day and basically use it to generate electricity at night. And we'll talk about deploying energy in targeted locations. Well, our example will be electric vehicles. And then we'll talk about using basically the grid that you're hooked up to interregionally to other grids in order to exchange power whenever you have surpluses, find a customer for it. Whenever you have needs, be able to buy some. So those are the 4 examples that we'll look at. So here we have the example of just simply installing the photovoltaic panels in a different orientation. Take a certain number of them. In this case, it's 100 megawatts of power, and basically shift that so that these panels are now pointing more to the west. So if you do that, what happens is you get more, this is the way it was in blue when you started, before you considered orienting new ones, and it becomes much more like this. So you get a significant amount of extra power during the evening. So that's one variation. That's a pretty simple idea. Just simply point the solar panels in a slightly different direction. If you do that, what happens is you make some small changes in the duct. Not much, but a little bit. And in this kind of analysis, a little bit adds because things interact. So here's the idea of storing the energy. Here we have the sun pouring some energy down onto these are called parabolic troughs. They're like U-shaped metal containers. And so the sunlight gets concentrated on these pipes here and basically warms up the water coming through the pipe, getting it warm enough so it can make steam. And then we take the steam, goes through a turbine, just like we did before. Turbine spins around, and makes a generator spin around, and out comes electricity. So what we do is we take off some of the extra power, the extra hot water, we put it in these tanks here, and we use that hot water at night to generate electricity. So that's the simple idea. So it's a form of storing some of the day's sunlight energy for use after the sun goes down. So you can get several hours of use out of this kind of process. So doing that again makes some changes. The duck's belly comes up a little bit here. The neck isn't quite as steep as it was before. So we're making some slow progress. Now, if you basically use the idea of cars, if you have a electric vehicle, you can take that electric vehicle during the day and you can use that and charge it up during the day. And then you can plug the electric vehicle into the grid at night so you can take some of the energy out of the car at night. So it's a clever way to basically use fairly cheap storage to make your needs less. So here we start to see some significant changes here. The head of the duck is down a little bit. The neck is down a little bit here. The belly is up a little bit. So we're making some progress. And finally, we can basically buy some energy or sell some energy at different times of the day from other grids. And if we do that, we basically make our economics a lot better and we make our loading better. So you put all those together and you end up with basically a curve that's very different. So in this case, notice how the head has come down here significantly and the beak has gone back here. So when we put these strategies together, we basically have a duck that's ready to do something. He started out with a big head way up here at around 4,000 megawatt, and his head's now down to, the peak is now down to maybe 3,000, significant change here. The belly is, notice the belly is now flattened out. So the steepness of the ramp here, instead of going up like this, goes up like this, much, much more gentle. So basically what we've done is we've basically been able to make some significant changes at very, very low cost. So to summarize it, what we have is a system that was, if you didn't count the wind and solar in it, it had a load factor of 73%. That meant that 27% of the equipment wasn't working at any point in time. And you do that in order to maintain reliability. You want to have a very high factor of reliability. You don't want the system to fail very often. So if you then look at the effect on this 73%, when you stick the solar wind, you need more and more idle equipment. So you're now down to 63% without the strategy. So if you use this strategy we just talked about here, you're up to 83%. So you're basically 10% better than you were without solar and wind. So you're saving an awful lot of money. And and the ramp is much easier, so you need less idle equipment. So that's the basic idea. So we've taught a duck to fly, essentially. Started out like this, changed a little bit, changed some more with another strategy, changed some more, changed some more. The head's getting lower, belly's being tucked in, head's getting lower. There you go, belly in more. And finally, requesting permission for takeoff. So the duck is ready to fly. So that's it for that part. I just wanted to say a few more things before we get to the questions. So we've learned a bunch during this 9 series of presentations. We've learned all about carbon reduction and how to do it, how to allocate it among various sectors. We've basically come up with an attitude that we can do it. In the process, we can do it in a timely manner. We can save trillions of dollars, and we can also save the planet as a nice place for us to dwell on. So the thought is we should be pretty happy here, sort of a rainbow solution here. And we thought that some sort of thing appropriate from the Wizard of Oz might be well to do here. That the problem of the scarecrow was that he didn't feel like he had enough brains, and the wizard informed him he really has enough brains, but he just needs a certificate to say that he has enough brains. So what we're going to be doing is sending you folks a certificate with the correct information in here. This is an old one that basically says you've been involved in this course. So I'd like to thank you for all your attention, all your support, and I'd like to get into the question session with you. So.
All right. Well, I know myself, and I'm sure everybody on this call really wants to thank Tom for not only this presentation, which has really been informative on these important topics, but really for this whole series. It's just been terrific to learn about things that at least myself wasn't very aware of. And again, really appreciate the presentation style and just how to better understand some of these fairly complicated and deep issues. So again, thank you so much, Tom. Let's go ahead and move into questions that anybody has or comments. One question would be, why would why the governor of Texas blame the blackout crisis on wind? What's that about?
That's a great Texas question. I lived in Texas for about 5 years, so I learned a little bit of the culture. And there was a story we used to tell about a bank robbery. The bank was robbed. The people were all excited about it. The sheriff came. The people were all pressing the sheriff. Do something, do something. So the sheriff goes out and shoots his horse. He did something. So in a crisis, the politicians feel they have to do something. And a lot of times that they should have done it 10 years ago, but they're a little late. So in the case there, I guess the governor just felt he had to say something that was made him look like he was in charge and knew what was going on. So he decided to pick on wind. I probably never liked wind anyway. So he went ahead and said the renewables caused us the problem. It wasn't natural gas at all. So it's always nice to be able to say, and in the fog of war, they say that in the fog of war, the first victim is truth.
Yeah, wouldn't it have been nice to hear somebody say, really, we just really wanted to save money, so we didn't provide proper backup, and we just didn't anticipate this kind of there. Wouldn't it have been nice to get the truth?
The problem they had is that everything that happened was predicted in 2011 because they had just had the same thing happen, but it wasn't quite as bad. So they wrote up a big report saying exactly what they needed to do to avoid this. You basically have to winterize your stuff, especially winterizing the wellheads. That's expensive. And you can winterize the rest of that stuff, the nukes and all that. That doesn't cost a whole lot. But winterizing those wellheads so that the water in them doesn't freeze, and trap the natural gas, that's expensive. So basically, they just try to duck.
Okay, well, Karen has a question here. Do most solar retailers offer storage thermal tanks?
Basically, what they do is most of the solar you have doesn't have anything where you store hot water. Okay, there are places like Ivanpah. Ivanpah is a big plant. I think it's the biggest one in the world. It's if you're going from California to Las Vegas, I think it's 15 up there. Anyway, it's about 10 miles or so from the border. There's this big plant that basically has a whole bunch of mirrors, and the mirrors basically are shaped so that they track the sun, and they point the reflection from the mirrors to like a hot water tank on top of a big tower. So you basically get all that energy concentrated there, and it basically makes steam, or you can use other heat exchange materials. So they basically take that water, or let's say heat exchange material, and they heat it up, and they put it to the side so that it's still hot whenever the sun goes down. So you can do that. Now the kind of solar that most people talk about for their house, or storage most people talk about for their house, is something like battery storage, where you basically take the excess, you put too many panels on your roof for your needs during the day. So you take that excess energy and you store it in the battery so that you can then run some portion of your house from the batteries during the evening. So that's what storage really usually means. And that's getting very popular. I think that more and more people, when they build solar roofs, are now finding it's economically advantageous. It got really advantageous whenever here in Southern California, where SDG&E changed its rates. They put some sky-high rates on during the early evening hours, because the load that they had experienced shifted from, during the day, due to the air conditioning and all that, because of all the solar stuff, it shifted it out to maybe 7 o'clock or so. So those people experienced a heck of a lot of expenses. And so what they basically did is they started to put batteries up to stay below the expense curve. I hope that helps.
Yeah, hi, Tom.
How you doing, Rob?
Oh, good, thanks, good. I got a couple of things in mind, questions. I'll try to just rattle them off fast. So in Dr. Hansen's book, Storms of My Grandchildren,
right?
It was a while ago, but he said that, I'm not a nuclear scientist, but, I want to move from a scenario where nuclear power is about 1% efficient to like 99% efficient. And so I thought that it sounds good. So I thought that he was going to try and move in the direction of, plutonium. And, then not only would we get more efficiency, but we'd be able to take all the old weapons and plow them into plowshares, And I thought, wow, this is super cool. So that's one little point out there. Dr. Hansen, as of 2015, still thinks nuclear is viable. I guess you're saying that, it's not, right?
Well, Jim, but maybe be clear, Jim is one of my heroes, okay? And
yeah, I know that. I know that.
And I completely agree with his stuff on climate change. I just don't think he's in the right corral for energy sources.
Right. Okay. So now when we're using that, teaching the duck to fly, when you're doing that, is that sort of the strategy that's used by Mr. or Dr. Jacobson up there at Stanford, where he basically says, I can do all this load balancing all across the planet, and basically it would entail putting about 0.5 or 1% of the Earth's surface devoted into this, with wind and solar, I mean, what would that look like, if you ramped out the logical extension of all of this load balancing worldwide? What would the future look like?
Well, there's two kinds of load balancing, okay? There's basically old fuddy-duddy load balancing, and there's like smarter load balancing. So that presentation, teaching a duck to fly, was to basically convert some of the old fuddy balancing people in the utilities and public utility commissions to believe there's a smarter way to run the grid. The basic idea of the old grid was you basically put whatever base load you got, and then when that doesn't work, you power up the peaking plants. So you have these big natural gas peaking plants there, and you just crank those things up whenever they're needed and turn them off when they aren't needed. So that's what that was about. Now, in terms of the whole planet, I think what you have to do is you have to start looking at what makes sense. In other words, if you need so many square feet of space for a given option, what is the economics of that? What's the effect of it? If you basically want to pave the whole Earth to basically have everything flat with solar panels, that might not be a smart option. So what you need is to basically look at what your options are and sort of put them together with some smart guys. Like, you assemble a group of people that they're pretty smart, that can say, okay, wind is characterized by this, solar is characterized by that, whatever else we're doing, tidal power is characterized by this. Basically look at what's available, and you put that together into something that's sensible. So what it ends up like is a good question, Rob, because you got to figure out things like how much room do you want to leave for the animals and stuff? Because we now know that if we basically hog up all the land, that that the viruses come and get us. So that's not a good option. So you have to have a sort of a health effects view also. So it's a good thing. I think that's what I'm going to be sort of focusing on next, is basically the big picture. And I think I'd like to maybe go talk to Jacobson to see what his ideas are. I don't know whether his stuff is, if the numbers add up or not, but I heard him give a speech several times, and he sure sounds really good. And the stuff I've read by him is good too. So I think I just take a little bit more confidence building for me to basically know what his grand strategy is.
Thank you.
Okay, and Larry is asking, and Larry, if you want to add to it, he just says, is anything 99% efficient?
There's some
Great.
physical limits of any machine that you could use, especially involving a heat transfer and entropy.
Well, I think, Larry, we better obey the laws of thermodynamics. I think that's a good idea, even if you don't get caught when you're trying to cheat. So yeah, you basically have to look at things and see what efficiency can you get. Now, for example, current solar panels, or my understanding is the ones that are economically available are something like 30 to 40% efficient. Now, if you do things like add a second layer to the panel, so basically there's some waste light that gets through, and maybe in the form of heat, and you basically put that below like a second layer for a solar panel, you can get a few more percent efficient. There are things you can do, like putting little magnifying glasses around that concentrate the solar energy. You can get some more efficiency, but there's going to be some number where, that's going to be it. So unless you have a different kind of way to do things, like automobile efficiency, we've been stuck at 30 miles per gallon, something like that, for a long time. And all of a sudden, we shifted technologies where essentially you're now getting something much better with the electric vehicle. So, sometimes you have to basically shift horses in midstream, essentially, to get something that's an improvement. But there'll always be people out there trying to get improvements. But if someone's selling you a 99% efficient thing, I would look at it very closely before I bought it.
I think he was speaking about the fuel conversion, only one part of the efficiency mix. That's all.
Well, the guy to look at that, if you're really interested in things like that, is Amory Lovins. What he does is he looks at a whole cycle, and he'll basically make a 2% improvement here, a 4% improvement here, a 1% improvement here. And when you put them together, all of a sudden it's a 25% improvement, because of the system dynamics of the thing. So yeah, a lot of these things require great details, but it's hard to do. And the people that figure these things out can make a fortune. And we need them.
Anybody else have questions or comments?
Okay, good. Well, it's been really great working with all you folks, and I've certainly enjoyed it and learned a lot. So I hope you've had a good time yourself, and I hope if we do something in the future like this, that you all join us.